the light of the world. And that he has been the light before there was light even created, right? There's this sense that the authority of Jesus' voice is embedded in his identity as this divine Son of God, or the light of the world. And that's clearly articulated in John's Gospel, and it is, as you heard, even sung in the hymn today, the dominant way in which we think about Jesus today. So most of our kind of religious understanding is that Jesus is the light of the world. And to be a Christian is to follow Jesus, that way, that light. And that Jesus lives inside of us, right? We give all of that authority to this one who manifested or articulated God's light in his time, but has this sort of eternal presence for all of us. And that is the dominant narrative that we've probably grown up with. But prior to that, earlier than that, back maybe in the 50s or so, the story was different. The story was that this light actually resides in everybody, and while Jesus was in touch with that and manifested it, it's inside of you, and it's inside of your neighbor. And I would argue it's inside of everything, but you definitely hear this in the Gospel of Thomas, that this sense of the way in which God is moving in the world is already inside of you, just not seeking it. Right? Pay attention to it within. And that's a completely different kind of narrative, because it shifts the dominant focus of the way in which you understand God stirring in the world to being some sort of revelation in the person and work and life of Jesus, to actually your life, your personhood, your work in the world, right? That's what you should be watching, because that's where God's moving now. It's a completely different energy. So I want to talk a little bit today about why the change, and I want to use Stephen Patterson, and I handed you out by now. You should all have the sheet, right? So if you don't have it, Russ can make sure that you get this, because there's probably no way you can read everything I've got on the board here, which I've scripted out with this big fat pen that I'm super excited about using today. So what I've done is I've layered a few things together here, and let me just walk through the diagram so that you understand it. On the outside circle, I wanted to kind of give you this sense of this sort of the diverse arc of the story of Jesus that manifests in each of the Gospels. And so as you can see, while it begins early in the 20s, which I'm going to talk about, by the time we get to the hundreds, you see like 4 different trajectories. And those 4 different trajectories are indicative of the way in which each of the Gospel writers, including the Gospel of Thomas, tries to give expression to the Jesus story in a little different way, and then sometimes a radically different way. And so even though we weave together the Gospels to make one narrative so that it all makes sense to us in church on Sunday morning, each of the Gospels has its own unique perspective on what is the point of Jesus' ministry anyway. Perfect example is Mark. Mark is not concerned at all about Jesus' birth, not really overly concerned about the resurrection, although he does mention it. Mark is more interested in the way in which his public ministry manifests, like how he shows up on the scene and his teaching ministry, and the way in which it's a nonviolent response to the pressures of Rome. That's kind of Mark's tight style. But by the time you get to Matthew and Luke, you've got this beautiful birth story that's folded into it. You've got extended resurrection stories that are added to it. It's a completely different energy to it in Matthew, Luke, and then even in John, where now you don't get a birth story, but Jesus pre-exists with God before time began. So you just feel the narratives, right, telling a different kind of story. So that's why the diagram is shaped like it is. The other thing that's in there is sort of general dating. So you'll see I'm going to start with the 20s, kind of a little bit before when Jesus comes on the scene. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The 30s, when Jesus was functioning as, that's called wander sage. That's what that phrase is. And then the Gospel of Thomas, which is this collection possibly of the Jesus sayings that existed, which we don't have, by the way. So that's a presumed document there. And then Mark's Gospel shows up around 70, after probably the fall of the temple, the destruction of the temple anyway, at 70 AD. Matthew and Luke follow suit in 80 and 90-ish, and then John around 100, And then I added Gospel of Thomas much later because the actual copy we have of the Gospel of Thomas, the manuscript we have, is a much later manuscript. And so it probably contains stuff that wasn't in the original kind of version of the Gospel of Thomas way back in the 50s. One of the books that I use to kind of navigate this is a gospel, set of the 5 Gospels constructed by scholars who tried to say, in their opinion, which phrases in each of the Gospels could we maybe attribute to the literal work of Jesus in the 30s. And they all fought over every line in every Gospel. And when they could all agree that that's pretty close to what we think would be the original words of Jesus, they would write that in red. And then if they thought, well, maybe it would be purple, and then it would be green, and blah, 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 and it would be black at the end, which means that Jesus, no way did Jesus say this, right? If you take this book and scroll through it quickly, you'll see a relatively amount of red in the Gospel of Thomas, because there's not a ton, but there's red in the Gospel of Thomas. There's red in Mark. There's little less red in Matthew and Luke, but Mark is in Matthew and Luke, so there's red in Matthew and Mark and Luke. In John, it's all black. There's no red at all. Isn't that interesting? There's nothing in John that scholars think came out of Jesus' mouth. And yet think about how dominant that theology is for us today. So what's happening here? So let me just do a little bit of then why, because this is to, somebody asked a great question a couple weeks ago about where Jesus got some of his content. And so I went back to the Jewish resistance. And one of the things that they think Jesus did, and to kind of build on what was happening prior, is that the Jews in Rome were not getting along very well. The Roman Empire was hard on everyday Jews. So in the 20s, there was a lot of resistance going on against Rome. And that resistance manifested in different ways. There was robbery, social robbery, kind of the old, what was his name? I'm thinking Peter Pan. Why am I thinking Peter Pan? Robin Hood. Thank you. That kind of Robin Hood mentality. Well, we'll steal from Rome and we'll redistribute the wealth that they're stealing from us back to our poor folk and our village folk. So robbery, remember the robbers on the road to Damascus who beat up the guy? Robbery was a thing, right? So that's a vibe that was happening in the Jewish resistance. Not paying your taxes, so resistance was a big approach. That, Rome is taxing the heck out of us. We Jews, we're not even going to pay our taxes. Something I should consider, frankly, these days. Not participating is another one. Another one was violence. Remember when Jesus was being crucified and they said, hey, who should we release here? Or when he's being judged, should we release Barabbas or Jesus? And they said, give us Barabbas. Why? Barabbas was a freedom fighter. He's more pragmatic, right? He was fighting for our freedom. And so Barabbas got the release, right? Not Jesus. So what was Jesus doing? Well, part of the resistance in the early 20s was a group called the Essene community. And for the most part, the Essene community was like, this culture is so broken that we're leaving it, we're going back into the desert, and we're seeking wisdom again in direct relationship to our God. And so the Essene community started creating wisdom material out in the wilderness. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a part of that material. That's where we find the Gospel of Thomas as a part of that body of work. Because what Jesus did, I think, which is so amazing, is that he kind of took on that wisdom literature model, but he took it into village life, right? He didn't do it out in the wilderness. He tried to help people live that wisdom in everyday life. And that was the beauty of this Jesus movement, of the wandering sage, if you will, that Jesus was so powerful. I think that's what his powerful, like his superpower was, is he could bring that to everyday people and help them feel a sense of liberation, even though they were living inside of this Roman dis-ease in the time. So by the time the Gospel of Thomas comes, it captures some of that literature. That literature works into Mark's Gospel, Matthew's Gospel, Luke, and then ultimately in John. So what's happening that is changing the narrative? And this is why I think Patterson is so brilliant. Patterson proposes, and this is what I put right in the middle, that all of these stories, and even the story we're trying to tell today, are always shaped and influenced by a changing social history or social context. That as the situation on the ground changes, as life changes, it has this effect, and that's why I did these little squiggly line arrows. That, and I had a fever all week, so this looks like I was on drugs when I did this. But this is shaping the story. And in fact, what Stephen Patterson says is that theology and social history are always woven together as one. They work together. And so if you were to think that religion is about God's divine story that is actually apart from social history, that actually is disconnected from social history and is some sort of divine intervention on how we are to live our lives, Stephen Patterson would say, no, it's a little bit more complicated than that. These people along the journey were paying attention to the way in which society was changing, the struggles, the opportunities, the challenges, the expansion, the contraction, the violence. They were paying attention to all of that, and they continued to tell the Jesus story in relationship to a changing social fabric and a changing context. So the question becomes for Patterson, what is, if you're going to keep religion fresh and vibrant, who's your talking partner? If your talking partner is a fixed entity, you could be in trouble. If your talking partner is actually the changing culture in which you find yourself, that keeps your religion alive. That's what Patterson would say. And he uses this phrase at the top. You can take this home and read it, but I'll just read this. Let's see. How much do I want to get into this? Because I only have 5 minutes. I got to quickly wrap this up. Well, I'm not going to read it to you at all. I'm going to tell you to read it yourself. But what Patterson is proposing is that if you will, the heartbeat of vibrancy of this arc is not that they tried to preserve the teachings of Jesus, but that the teachings of Jesus were always in conversation with context. And as context changed, the story began to change. And what I'm going to leave you with today, and I'm going to pick this up next week, what I'm going to leave you with today is that that's our job right now. Right? If you're going to take Patterson seriously, then the way in which this congregation thinks about its future and the story it wants to continue to tell in the culture has to happen in conversation with the issues of our time. And that's what keeps it relevant. That's what keeps it important. That's the heartbeat that drives the story. And all of these gospel writers were doing that. But sometimes we just think it was just like the Word of God divinely dropped, and that's the end of that, right? We take it all like that, we lock it in time and place, but that's not the way it actually unfolded, and that's not the way it should unfold today. It should always have this dynamic relationship with context. So I'm going to leave it there, but next week when we look at this, I'm going to try to expand on this theme for one more time and try to think about, well, what might this look like? But I think it's fitting today as we move into an annual meeting to think about, I'm retiring, there's going to be a new era here at this congregation. If we're listening to the voices that guide the future, how are we integrating the voices of the very cultural context in which we live? We're not just like historians perpetuating yesterday's story, right? We're in conversation with climate issues. We're in conversation with violence and polarization. We're in conversation with identity issues. We're in conversation with global awareness. We're in conversation these days even with artificial intelligence and AI. Did you notice the other day the Germans had a whole worship service all done through AI? Yeah. So they basically use a chat bot or whatever it's called, right? And they told it lead worship, and everybody and it led the entire worship service. All digital. There's no bodies, so you don't even have to hire anybody. Just get a computer up here, and it will parse Lutheran theology and give it right back to you. And maybe it'd even do a better job of figuring out how to integrate social constructs and content. I don't know. But anyway, that's the world we live in. That's what these people were doing, and that's why the trajectory diversified. That's okay. That's not something to be afraid of. That's been going on from the very beginning, right? And that's important for us to acknowledge. All right, I'm going to leave it there for this week. Next week, I'm going to be in Vermont, but I have pre-recorded the lecture. It will kind of expand on what might this look like for us today. But I think it's super empowering when you think about our personal stories matter when it comes to our theological understanding and how we bring meaning to life, and our collective story matters too. So let's make sure we're in conversation with both. All right. Mark, why don't you come up and guide us to the